So, welcome back to Third Age Reforged, and we're going to be doing another one of these tier lists today, and today we're going to be moving on to one of the Evil Men factions, and probably the best all-rounder among the Evil Men at that, and that's going to be Rune, with their very distinct Golden Dragon scale style among their better units. Rune, versatility is one of the main things I think about when I think of Rune. They definitely have a few smaller focuses around stuff like AP, which obviously they have quite a lot of throughout their roster, and also they have some... That's both in melee and at range, to be fair. But there are very few aspects of warfare that Rune can't contest at the very least, which does make them a pretty good pick if you're going into a sort of a blind pick, as it were. If you don't know what your opponent's going to be playing, Rune are fairly safe. Now, there are a few bad matchups. While Rune can sort of spread their strengths out quite evenly, Rune, because of their slight AP focus, there are a few matchups which aren't terribly favourable to them. Linden is one very well documented example because of course the AP is not going to be very useful against them, and Linden are strong in certain ways that can punish Rune a little bit. But we're not talking about the faction as a whole, we're going to be talking about their individual units and where I think they fit in. Again, same scale of S right down to F. The criteria is reasonably sort of harsh, I would say, but I'm not going to be as harsh as I think I was going to be initially. F is the only thing where you have to really be quite a useless unit to get into F. I don't believe Rune have got any of those, at least not anymore. But they may very well, I fully expect a few of them to get into S. Starting off with the Easterling Clansmen. Now the Easterling Clansmen are kind of an interesting unit because I've said time and time again that they may be the best human militia swordsmen in the game. And part of this is because they have a lot of men in the unit and the fact they can upgrade their armour twice. Having said that, if you do that, they actually aren't all that much cheaper, if at all, than regular line infantry from some other factions. So you do have to take that into account. Like, while they are a militia swordsman, they're not so dirt cheap on the same level as like the very cheap goblins, for example, that they get enormous value for money. But certainly against certain factions, I would say they are going to be a very important part of your roster, especially when it comes to trying to make up for the fact that most of your units have that AP focus. If you don't necessarily need that, then the Easterling Clansmen fully upgraded could be the way to go. But I have been struggling on where to put them, to be honest with you. But I think, based on the fact that there is a unit in their roster which you will often see instead of the Easterling Clansmen, I think I'm going to put them into B, because they do perform above average. They are better than most other unit of this, most of the other units of this type in the game. But I wouldn't put them up into A, to be honest with you, because the value proposition is good, but it's not spectacular in the way that I would want it to be for a unit of this tier to get into A. Then we move on to the Easterling Warriors. Now the Easterling Warriors have a supposed niche against those lightly armoured opponents that your armour piercing is not going to be quite so effective against. The issue with that is most of those factions are going to have a fairly strong lineup of skirmishers, which is the hardest counter possible to the Easterling Warriors, because they have light armour. They can only upgrade their armour once as well, unlike the Easterling Clansmen who can do it twice. They lack a shield. Arrows are going to have a field day against them. They're going to get massive value off of them. They're also a little bit more expensive than the Easterling Clansmen. Less men in the unit as well. This could be a contender for F, but I would say it's not entirely useless is the thing. Because in those select matchups, like against Linden, for example, they're probably the best yardstick to use for that. They will do decently enough if you can get them into melee because of their numbers and the fact they have that high melee defense, but those examples are very few and far between, to be honest with you. And they do sort of take up a unit spot that, I mean, you so rarely see them. I think I have to be harsh here, and I think I'm actually going to put them into F, you know. Because I cannot think of a single time where I would actually bring the Easterling Warriors other than to try and be creative with them. If I was trying to just build an effective army, I think I'd leave them out every single time, to be honest with you. And that kind of puts them into the same role as the Norritino Cavalry, which I put into F. So yeah, I'm going to put them down there, to be honest. Now, Easterling Guard. Now, Easterling Guard kind of fall into the same pitfalls, to be honest with you. They're a little bit more expensive. Their stats are a little bit higher. They can have their armour upgraded as well, but in much the same way as the Easterling Warriors, it doesn't really help them too much. Arrows are still going to be an absolutely massive problem for them. The main difference is they do actually have a purpose, and that is the fact they can be used to zone out cavalry to a certain extent. because they're still going to do quite poorly if cavalry charges into them and sort of connects quite well. They're going to lose a lot of men in that charge. But at the very least, the fact that you can use them to sort of zone out cavalry in your back ranks does give them more utility than Easterling Warriors. So I think for that reason, I'll put them into D, because they're still certainly one of Rune's less impressive units overall. So far, actually, it's not been so good for Rune other than the Easterling Clansmen, but this is where things start to turn around. The heart and soul of their army, in much the same way as Isengard have got a trio of units that you very often see, the same is true for Rune, starting off with the Look Flag Rim. Now, the Flag Rim actually are a bit of an outlier themselves as well, because line infantry macemen, such as themselves, armor-piercing line infantry, tend to actually be kind of underwhelming in the game, to be honest with you, when you consider the other, well, the competition that they've got around them. Stuff like the Mercenary Guildsmen, which yes, they're cheap, but they rout easily, and in most of the factions they're a part of, there is a better option than themselves. And around the same sort of level as the Flag Rim, you have stuff like the Balakith Shield Bearers and the Black Swans from Dol Amroth, both of which never really seem to garner the same sort of efficiency as the Flag Rim seem to. And there isn't really much of a reason for this from a statistical standpoint, as far as I can tell. It could be the fact that when you're Dol Amroth and Anumbar, you have other units which you're used to performing a little bit better than the Maceman, and it may just be because Rune don't really have a massable higher tier line infantry unit like this. You're sort of more used to Rune's performances. But even considering that, I still think the Flag Rim tend to perform better than those units overall, certainly from a cost efficiency standpoint next to something like the Black Swans. And I think for those reasons, you always see them. Against most factions as well, the armor piercing will be useful in some respects. Sometimes it can be absolutely brilliant. Sometimes it can just be kind of but it will. There's only a few matchups in which it will actively hurt you, because of course the AP does mean lower base attack and lower base defense in certain quantities. But I think you have to put them into A. I think they're such a big part of what Rune do. I wouldn't put them into S because they never perform to a super high level every single time you see them. But I would put them into A because I think that they definitely deserve that. And they will probably honestly be the only basic level maceman, or sort of mid-tier sort of standard maceman, that will probably make it that high. I can't really think of any others off the top of my head that would deserve to get up to A tier, to be honest with you. It'd probably be B or C for most of them. So this is a mark of good quality from the Flag Rim. Next, we have the only Runic Phalanx unit that they have, which is another slight downside to playing as Rune, because they do have these halberds in the Gamp Rim, but of course pikes can outrange them. So if you go pike to halberd, the pike will win over a long period of time, even though, to be honest with you, often the fight will be decided in locations other than that fight, in a real battle situation. But yeah, the Gamp Rim, again, adds AP to the front line, gives your front line a little bit more rigidity again, with the exception of if you are facing down a lot of pikes. The Gamp Rim will do just fine at helping your infantry really shore themselves up. Halberdiers are kind of an interesting one because, again, in much the same way as the Maceman, there aren't that many exceptional Halberdiers in the game, but neither are there that many bad halberds in the game. They all sort of occupy the same sort of space. Again, it's quite similar with Rangers as well. They all kind of do the same thing. And I think for those reasons, I think you have to put the Gamp Rim into B, because they have a clearly defined weakness. They're good, and they definitely help hold down the front line, but I wouldn't put them up to A with the Flag Rim, because they don't really do anything that other halberds don't. And again, clearly defined weaknesses. Arrows are still going to be an issue, even if they do have a slight shield bonus. It's not enormous. And their armour is, again, okay, but not brilliant. Sort of middle of the road in those terms for Rune, in comparison to a lot of other factions. But I think B is probably fair for them. You'll see them an awful lot, but that's to be expected from a unit, the only Phalanx unit that Rune have. Then we have the Sion Rim. Now the Sion Rim, of course, are essentially the Bulwark. They don't have the armour piercing that the other two Golden Boys have, but they are significantly tougher to bring down, and they're very reliable as well. I think as well, like this, I do have a bit of a soft spot for the Sion Rim, because the rest of the Runic roster that we've already seen, the A and B tiers, I would say, more so than the D and F, because even with the A and B tiers, they are a little bit less durable than some of the forces you're going to be coming up against. They're capable of dishing out the damage, especially against armoured targets, but if it comes down to a sheer war of attrition, you may end up losing because you just don't have quite the same rigidity. That is unless you bring the Sion Rim. And I think based on just the performances that I've seen them put in, I have to put them into A tier. They tend to be a really nice glue to hold everything together for you. They're good against cavalry. They will do damage relatively slowly against other infantry, but Rune aren't exactly lacking for attacking options when it comes to dishing out the damage. So I think, just based on synergy, I will put the Sion Rim into A. Then we shall move on to the Camel's Shadow Guard. Now the Shadow Guard are the shock infantry that Rune have available to them. And again, an interesting kind of unit. Most shock infantry is going to be relatively fragile. Obviously, once again, arrow fire can be a bit of an issue for them. Rune are kind of a very mixed bag when it comes to their infantry being good against arrows, like the golden units with their shields. The Gamprim even have got that small shield value. The Easterling Clansmen, of course, can be a great tar pit. But there are several examples in their infantry where they have very fragile targets. So if your opponent is paying attention to you, they should be able to focus down your more vulnerable units. So you definitely need to be on your toes and commit things at the right time. The thing the Shadow Guard have in their favour, though, that helps them mitigate that is the fact they can hide. Now, this does afford them quite a bit of utility, to be honest with you. I think, however, based on the performances I've seen them put in the past, I think a fair place to put them will be B. The ability to hide is most useful to stop them being shot at by arrows, to be honest with you. It's very rare that you'll be able to pull off like a fully fledged ambush. There are certain maps which sort of lean into that a little bit more, but if we're assuming that we're playing on something like the arena, for example, which I showed recently, more often than not, it's going to be more useful to stop you from just getting shot. When it comes to pulling off an ambush, yes, they can do that, but most successful ambushes, in my experience, I've seen have been achieved with ranged units more so than with melee. It can be done, and it is a point in their favour, but it's not the sort of thing that I think would be enough to raise them to A tier all on its own. And outside of that, I think, as shock infantry is, with a few exceptions, once again, I think B is fairly good for the Shadow Guard, and obviously more AP to the Runic front line as well. Now then, Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, the assassin unit for Rune. Now, assassins are one of those weird things because they have been changed in the most recent version of the game, 0.97.1, and they have been improved, but I'm not entirely sure how much they've been improved. I've seen them used, and I've seen them used quite well, but they're definitely not like an overpowered unit by any means. Like, this goes for stuff like the Guildsmen here. It also goes for other assassins like the Thieves of Tharbad or the Hashari. And I think the Dragon's Wrath Guildsmen, once again, I find myself thinking the only place I could put them and feel confident about it is B tier. Because they have a huge amount of melee defense. They're capable of dishing out a lot of damage with their projectiles first. However, they are very much a flash in the pan, which is by design. Like, you're supposed to get them onto an important target of a unit. They'll inflict massive damage onto it, if not outright defeat it, but it will be a localized Pyrrhic victory, to put it that way. And I think for those reasons B tier is fair for them, because they definitely don't offer you the all-round solidity that the Flag and Sion Rim do, at least in my opinion. Now then, Camel's Chosen, the only bodyguard tier infantry unit that Rune have at their disposal. They've been made a little bit better in the current patch. They were a little bit bleh in the last patch, to be honest with you. They never really performed to the level that you would want them to, for a unit that cost as much as they did. Now they're a little bit stronger, and considering they're Rune's only option when it comes to a bodyguard tier infantry unit, you would hope that they would have something to offer, and they do. But once again, I think, based on the fact that, unlike the Wardens of the White Tower, who have to contend with the fact that you have the Nimlothian Honour Guard, which if you want a foot bodyguard unit, you're always going to pick the Nimlothians pretty much. There's really no time where I see myself picking the Wardens over them. Unlike that unit, which the Camel's Chosen is very comparable to, the Wardens might even be a little bit stronger in terms of their outright stats, but I think I would put the Camel's Chosen up into B tier just because they don't have any competition in that regard, but they do still stumble into the same pitfalls that the Wardens of the White Tower do, in the sense that they're good at what they do. They're kind of like the white bread of the Sword and Shield bodyguard world. They just kind of do their thing, but nothing else. And I think that kind of lands them in B tier, like so many other Runic units so far. And so that's Rune's infantry. Fairly decent, but nothing too exceptional, especially not compared to some of the factions we've already seen, like Khazad-dûm and Imladris, and even Gondor, to be fair. yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair for Rune, to be honest. Now then, archers. Rune's ranged abilities are very varied in much the same way as their whole faction is, to be honest with you. And I would say archers and cavalry is something they do lean a little bit more on. And I think we will see that actually as the list unfolds here. Starting off with the Easterling Hunters, most evil factions will have access to something like this. A very cheap archer which has got a lot of men in the unit. Individually they're not very good, of course, but really, really good at wearing down your opponent's abilities to skirmish with you. Which I think, again, to be honest with you, leads it to deserving a spot in B tier. Because if you're going up against a faction which is going to be more insistent on skirmishing with you, like for example Lothlorien or Mirkwood, you know, those two Sylvan Elf factions, you're never going to be able to outperform them in terms of damage, but you can outlast them with Rune quite easily if you build your army around that sort of thing. And it can leave them feeling a little bit uncomfortable. It'll leave them having to rely basically on the abilities of their archers in melee, which, as we'll get onto when we talk about Mirkwood and Lothlorien, they aren't exactly out of luck when it comes to that sort of thing. But it does take away their plan A from them. And I think the Easterling Hunters deserve B tier for that sort of thing. It's not just the elves, they can do that against after all. It's pretty much any skirmish heavy faction. And it'd be quite annoying as well if you face off against Rune and they bring that amount of archers, because you have no choice really but to either skirmish with them or be far more aggressive than you initially intended to be. Now then, Crossbowmen. Crossbowmen are an interesting one in the game. I suppose I have been quite harsh on crossbows in the past, but not so much on the runic crossbows, because they are pretty much what you would expect crossbows to be. Very damaging, a lot of stopping power, armor-piercing missiles. Even the very strongest units don't want to be caught too long in the sights of crossbows. However, the Easterling crossbows are fragile. They do not skirmish well with other crossbows, unlike some of the heavily armoured options from factions we'll get onto in the future. And I think that it obviously makes them worse. It makes them a lower tier of crossbow than those crossbows, but it does at least earn them a little less of my ire for that reason. I feel as though it's kind of how crossbows should act mechanically. That's a whole different debate, however. I think the Easterling crossbows, I mean, they do have the ability to upgrade their armour, but that's not enough to really make them good in a skirmish fight, really. And once again, I find myself putting another unit into B tier, honestly. Because again, they're very good. They can do pretty much the same sort of damage as other crossbows can do, but they're easier to deal with if you're facing them down than something like the really heavily armoured Ironfoots or the hiding Corsairs, which is why I think B, once again, is a very fair place to put them. Now then, we get on to a slightly higher tier of Archer in the Variag Mercenaries. Now, I've said time and time again that I actually rate the Variag Mercenaries quite highly, and I stand by that, because while the Easterling Hunters will skirmish with the enemy and get their value just because of their sheer quantity, the Variag Mercenaries do so with a bit of quantity but also with a bit of solidity. They can have their armour upgraded, they have that shield, they are pretty much the runic equivalent of the Balaguer Archers, if not slightly better even than the Balaguer Archers, because the Balaguer Archers' base armour is actually pretty low. Both units can have their armour upgraded, of course, but I think, based on the fact that Rune, they have so many options for dealing damage in the late game if you can conserve them well, the ability to skirmish with an enemy efficiently, I think they are a unit which I see not brought too often. I think I'm putting them into A. I mean, I think I've got to make a point by putting them into A, to be honest with you, because I see the Rim brought more than them, even in situations where the Variag Mercenaries should be the unit that's on the field. Not to say the Rim don't have their place, of course, and we'll get onto them in just a second. But first, the Baltroth Tribesmen, a basic unit of javelins. Again, basic javelins such as this are... they're not as cheap as stuff like the Snaga skirmishers, but they're not that much more expensive. And I think, based on the fact that Rune have armour piercing and so many other options, they're not quite as dependent on their javelins to do that sort of thing for them in the way that a faction like Linden might be. But again, you can't really take too much away from them. I think, once again, we have to place them into B, because they're better than just being completely average, but I couldn't put them into A, because I've never really seen them used to devastating effect, but as part of a system, they work very, very nicely, I think. There is a real theme emerging here with Rune, isn't there? And I think that's not going to stop anytime soon, because we have the Nar Rim, and the Nar Rim have less men in the unit than the Variag Mercenaries. They're slightly more offensively focused, so if you are on the front foot and you're not being hit by enemy skirmish fire, they're probably the superior choice, but it's a very rare situation you're going to be in where the enemy is not firing shots back at you. You know, against a rush perhaps, but if you've brought too many archers against a rush, you may be doomed anyway, especially as Rune. I think B. I think B is very fair for them, because again, they perform their role quite adequately, but they're fairly expensive for what they are, and most other human archers of this tier, certainly from the Western Kingdoms, tend to offer more in the long run. And I think that's why the Nar Rim have to land in B, to be honest. Now, the Camel Shadowbows, the Rangers that Rune have available to them. Any faction that has access to Rangers has got a potentially devastating weapon in a siege. Still strong on a field battle potentially, but a bit more difficult to use in that sense. And like I said before, Rangers, they can either be, well, there are a few units of Rangers that I would put into S tier because of some additional little bits and pieces that they have going for them, such as the Adunheim Shadowbows we saw previously. The Camel Shadowbows are not that though. Like, they are just a unit of bog standard Rangers, much like the Athelian Rangers we've seen before, and for that reason, like I said, they're going into A tier. Oh, no, sod it, that'll do. Camel Shadowbows in A tier, like most units of Rangers are, because they don't do anything extra like the S tier Rangers do, but I mean, the devastation you can cause with them potentially means they certainly can't go any lower than A in my book. Balchoth Sapphire Bladesmen, a unit which was buffed in the recent patch, which they did sorely need because they did less damage than some standard javelins actually in the last patch, which would have put them in C, possibly even D tier if I was feeling particularly harsh. Now though, they've been made a little bit stronger, but I would say the emphasis is on a little bit. I think the Balchoth Sapphire Bladesmen among the other higher tier javelin men, when you consider the competition they have, obviously the mighty Demons of the Desert, the Ferodrim Javelins with their spiky armor-piercing clubs, the Medicel Guard with their ability to be, you know, a sword and board bodyguard unit, which can be really useful for RHUN when it comes to fighting on foot. The Dunedain Troll Slayers, who are a little bit less expensive, but tend to perform better on average, to be honest with you, than the Balchoth Sapphire Bladesmen. Now, I'm not saying the Sapphire Bladesmen are a poor unit, but also the problem Rune have is they have another high-tier expensive skirmisher that they can bring. And for that reason, I think, again, I've got to put them into B, because they're better than C tier now, I will say that, but most of the time, considering how expensive they are and considering the other options Rune have available to them, I think B is probably just about right for them, to be honest. Now then, this is where we come to the Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen. Dragon's Wrath Crossbowmen are, I mean, they're not as intended at the moment. You know, they're kind of, the devs will be working on a way, I think, to try and make that splinter shot projectile they had work. The problem with that in the past, obviously, was that without a completely clear line of sight, they would just refuse to fire, which was infuriating a lot of the time. And even when they did fire, to be honest, kind of underwhelming. Now, though, they are effectively exactly the same thing as the Blacklock Engineers. Now, that might be temporary, and in the future this might have to change, depending on how the splinter shot ends up working. But considering they are effectively just a runic golden version of the Blacklock Engineers from Erebor, that of course means they're going into S tier. Rune's first entry into S tier. But yeah, body piercing in the same way that Rangers are, armor piercing in the same way that Crossbows are, strong enough to withstand a beating from ranged units as well because of their multiple HP. In a siege, it's a no-brainer, even on the open field, to be honest with you, considering their abilities in melee as well as their abilities to zone out cav. Very rare, I think, you'll see them go without the Dragon's Wrath at this point. Now then, the cavalry. Pretty varied lineup of cavalry that Rune have, which is good because it means that they can contest against most other factions when it comes to cavalry. They're probably not top 3 in terms of cav, but they're definitely not bottom 3 either, to put it that way. The lowest tier of cav is the mounted version of the Easterling Guard, the Easterling Horse Guard. Obviously they're subject to the same armour upgrades and such that the footbound variant is, albeit they're a little bit more useful, I think. Emphasis on a little bit, because I do think there are other options in the Runic Cavalry Force which deserve higher praise than the Easterling Horse Guard. However, if you want to secure the cavalry advantage, because they are spear cavalry, they do have a slight bonus against other cav, especially if you combine them with your high tiers. Rune can be pretty difficult to deal with in melee on horseback. Problem is, of course, they lack a shield, their armour is still relatively thin even with the upgrade, so ranged units can be a real problem in much the same way as they can be with the Gondor cavalry. But unlike the Gondor cavalry, the force around them is such that they themselves look a little bit better. So they go into C tier, Rune's first option there. Now then, the Inas Rim, who were subject to a little bit of a buff in the patch as well. As most Lancers were, their morale was increased, because most basic Lancers would charge into an enemy formation, refuse to cycle back out and then break immediately, which meant that basic Lancers were so rarely seen and only high tier cavalry was brought. That is still a little bit of an issue, I would say. You don't see regular Lancers as much as you do still see the highest tier options, but they are at least a little bit stronger than they used to be, and they are still very good at charging into infantry. Heavy armour as well, these sort of heavier Lancers are a little bit better at keeping themselves alive. Unlike the little tooltip there, they do have a shield now as well, which sort of takes away from one of their major weaknesses in the past, which was that archers could shoot into them from the front, and the armour, while thick, would not be able to absorb all of that damage. So I think, once again, we've got to put them into B. I think it's another example of a B tier unit. Now then, we'll actually save the chariots for in a minute, because they're more of a ranged cavalry option anyway. The Dragon's Wrath Warlords. Now, the Warlords are a unit of multiple HP Lancers, which are not quite as devastating all around as Knights. And the Runic ones are also quite interesting as well, because most of these multiple HP Lancers will be very fast. So stuff like the Black Serpents from Harad, the Royal Court of House Thorondor as well from Cardlin is pretty quick considering the heavy armour on it. However, Dragon's Wrath Warlords are more of a heavy cataphract style unit, and so they're a little bit slower, but they're also a little bit tougher. They actually bear more in common with something like the Mithrandir's retinue from Gondor than perhaps some of the other fellow Eastern cavalry. I think, however, they can still be dealt with by anti-cavalry, of course, quite efficiently, but you often do see them riding alongside the Dragon Knights, which we'll talk about in just a second, because it gives Rune's cavalry a really heavy feel to it. Very difficult to bring down quickly. If you surround them as well with some Inas Rim or the Horse Guard, depending on what sort of cavalry force you want, whether it's to neutralise the enemy cav with the Horse Guard, or whether it's to go fully on the offensive with the Inas Rim, which I think Rune are actually pretty good at now, considering their ability to weather a storm. I think A is fair for the Warlords, to be honest, because they don't go above and beyond in the same way that some cavalry units can do at killing infantry, but as part of a greater system, once again, they have a lot of value to Rune, I believe. And the Dragon Knights, now, being a knight unit on its own does not guarantee S tier in the same way as it would a ranger, as the same way that rangers don't have their S tier place guaranteed. However, there are a few knights in the game which I would say they have little bits and pieces to them, which means they do deserve to be held in slightly higher esteem. We talked about the Gwaithir Rockdor being probably the best unit of all-rounders in terms of their speed, in terms of their abilities in melee, their charge, their armour, and I think the Carmel's Dragon Knights, alongside the offering from Arthedain, are the two tankiest units of knights in the game, which their ability to keep themselves alive as long as possible is very important, because even a battered and bruised unit of knights in the late game can prove to be the difference between victory and defeat. And Rune's cavalry is important to them on an open field if they hope to seize control of the battle, I think. And I think for that reason, I would put them into S tier, to be honest with you. I think they are... You always see them on the open field when you're facing Rune. Like, you almost never see someone go without the Dragon Knights, because you'd be crazy not to bring them. You know, they're so tough, they're so tanky. I've seen them withstand a huge amount of punishment from an overwhelming amount of wargs, and they're an anti-cavalry unit. And it can be quite frustrating to try and deal with that sort of thing as well. I do think the Arthedain variant is slightly the tankier of the two, but honestly it's very close between them, and I think their importance to Rune can't be understated. Now then, ranged cavalry. Ranged monstrous cavalry, you could say, in the form of the chariots, the Runic Chariots. I think the chariots are another one of those units where it's very high risk, high reward. They can either be devastating or they can be absolutely worthless, and it is also quite highly dependent on map whether or not they're going to be useful or not. A more constrictive map is going to make it easier for the opponent to wall up against them. Whereas in a more open map, you're probably going to find more gaps. You're probably going to be able to run into some nice blobs to do the damage. You need to keep them moving at all times, of course. All of the chariots are pretty much subject to the same kind of strengths and weaknesses. The runic ones, I would say, however, are probably the lowest tier because they are archers, which are on the back, whereas all of the others have got either crossbows or javelins, which are a little bit more useful, I think, when it comes to dealing damage with the missiles, which is obviously more of a bonus than anything. Like the chariot's main goal is going to be disruption, but the missiles are obviously something which you can count on to do a lot of damage. And to be fair, they are very damaging archers, but they're not quite as good as the Crossbowmen from Erebor and Karn or the javelins from Linden. And I think the highly situational nature of chariots means that I think most chariots are probably going to find themselves in B tier, with the exception of one, I think, but we'll get onto that in the future. But yeah, I think B is probably fair because, again, very situational, potentially hugely damaging, but situational. And the final unit, which we will be having a look at, well, actually, technically the final unit is going to be the Variag Mercenary Riders, the unit of horse archers that Rune have, the mounted version of the Variag Mercenaries on foot. And very much like the footbound variant, they're a pretty good unit of horse archers, actually. I would say that their abilities are more in harassment and preventing the enemy from approaching the battle in the way they may want with their own cavalry. Particularly good at hunting down wargs, like most horse archers are. They can also skirmish with enemy horse archers pretty effectively because of their shields. The issue may be that if you're facing down a horse archer presence, it's probably going to be from a faction like Karn or RHUN, who can just outright outnumber the Variag Mercenary Riders. But, again, they may be slightly situational for Rune, but as an accompaniment to a very strong cavalry force, I think B is probably fair for them as well, to be honest with you. I couldn't put them into C, they're much better than that, but I don't think they quite warrant an A tier position because, again, like in the world of horse archers, there are definitely factions which can outrank Rune. So there we have it. I mean, the Dragon's Breath cannon is also something which you can consider because it is a unique artillery piece after all. I think if I was going to put the Dragon's Breath somewhere, it's no longer the absolutely overpowered monster that it was in the last patch where it would have been S tier without any sort of question. I think now you would probably put it into B, maybe A tier if you were feeling generous because of its very strong artillery crew. It's one of the examples in the game of an artillery crew actually being very strong in melee. So that is points for it for that, but it's no longer the tour de force that it was in the past. And I would say that it really is kind of like a slightly beefier ballista with a really strong crew. Maybe it does deserve to be in A tier for that, I don't know. But it also can't really take down fortifications on walls either. So that's something worth bearing in mind. So yeah, that is Rune, and as you can see, as a faction which is well known for being more of a jack of all trades, they are quite middle of the road, aren't they? Like I'm actually quite surprised at just how many units are in B tier. But I stand by that, honestly. There aren't very many units in that lineup that I think would place too differently. And yeah, I mean, Rune are honestly one of the factions that I would suggest are pretty good for newer players, just because they have access to every tool. So you can kind of find a playstyle that you like, and then maybe you can go off to another faction that sort of specialises a little bit more heavily in that. If there is a sort of a downside to being Rune, is that jack of all trades, master of none, really. There isn't really any one aspect that they are supreme in. You know, cavalry is pretty strong, their range presence is strong and varied, their infantry, when it comes to armour piercing, is good. But there are factions which do all of those things better than Rune. But there are also really no factions that do all of those things at the same time, other than maybe Arthur Dane, but even that's debatable because of the armour piercing Rune have available to them. So yeah, that's my sort of assessment of Rune's units, as it were. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and whether or not you think I'm a fool and these are all in the wrong order. As for the next tier list, which I'm not sure when that will be, because the next video will probably be another battle replay, to be honest with you. But the next tier list, we're going to be returning to the Elven Realms, and I think I had a request for Mirkwood, so they will probably be the next tier list that we do. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this, I hope you found it somewhat informative, and I hope you will join me for whatever is next.